Well, it's a hard day to forget.
We realised on looking at the CCTV the extreme nature of the violence.
I think when we saw those images of those men dressed in those Garda ERU uniforms, you knew this was a really serious incident.
There was no guards there. There was a lot of media there. And the only reason we were there was to see really who was with Daniel Kinahan.
Let's be clear on one thing. Nobody knew anything was going to happen. The Kinahans didn't know they were going to be attacked or they'd never come into the country. They believed there was no threat against them.
But where were they on the day? That's a reasonable question, I think.
Of course, they did commit murder on that day.
And we then heard the name David Byrne for the first time. The guards will say that the intention of the Hutch gang that day was to take out a whole senior tier of the cartel. The revenge is going to come.
She was down trying to keep him alive on the ground on her two knees. It was unbelievable, like, you know, what was happening.
The Kinahans were already going about identifying those people and figuring out how they were going to kill them.
It really was a matter of end it, kill them all.
We didn't know until the day that the case was actually opened that the accusation against the monk was actually going to be that he was the gunman.
I do not believe the state of the stomach to go for another Regency trial. There's two that have ended in disaster for the state.
There's still people walking around out there who had a part to play in these.
Ten years ago, on February 5th, 2016, a six-man hit team entered the Regency Hotel during a boxing weigh-in. Their attack marked a turning point, one that would send shockwaves through Ireland's criminal underworld.
It was a Friday and I was in work. It was a quiet day, so two members of our team had been sent out to the Regency because we knew that Daniel Kinahan was in town. We knew that there had been problems within the Kinahan grouping, that it had pretty much split. So it seemed like, you know, go and see what's happening.
Well, it's a hard day to forget. You ask any journalist, where were you on the day? I was in the newsroom. It was a normal day like any other. We knew, and I suppose every crime journalist in Ireland knew, that there was a boxing weigh-in event happening at the Regency Hotel and that the Kinahans were there. At this point, the name Daniel Kinahan, you know, was certainly well known amongst crime journalists. Not so much maybe in the papers every single day as he is now over the last 10 years, but we knew who he was, and it was important for a lot of people to be there on that day. And then I remember the phone call came through. There's been a shooting at the Regency Hotel, and it was a matter of, let's get our journalists there quick. A colleague of mine headed straight there. I was hitting the phones, and we were trying to just establish as quickly as we could what exactly had happened here. When we arrived on the scene, I mean, it was very chaotic. That was really clear that this was a major incident. You know, a lot of the people who were in the hotel, maybe the staff and so on, were outside. You could see they were very shocked. And really the talk was that this had been a very serious incident. It was chaotic in those first couple of hours, and you're wondering whether any innocent people had been caught in the crossfire. There were hundreds of people attending that event, and indeed a horrific video came out in the hours that followed, just people running, fleeing for their lives effectively, and felt like a terrorist attack, really. It probably wasn't until the images appeared in the media the following day that we realised just how daring the attack was. I mean, you had one person dressed as a woman running from the hotel carrying a handgun. You had really good quality close-up images of three other people dressed in, you know, mock tactical ERU Garda uniforms. They had helmets on, balaclavas over their faces. They were carrying AK-47s. I think when we saw those images of those men dressed in those Garda ERU uniforms, you knew this was a really serious incident. This was an extraordinary and audacious gangland attack. They barged straight into this ballroom where there were hundreds of people in attendance and caused chaos. This idea that such a heavily armed gang had entered a packed hotel
and really indiscriminately opened fire, having chased people through the hotel. It was a really extraordinary event, and I don't think it's like anything I've ever seen during my time in journalism.
At the time of the Regency, I was Detective Chief Superintendent in charge of the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau. And then we got a call about the Regency, and it was a little bit confusing at first, and that happens in these sort of events, that when there are no police at the scene or at the time of it, you're depending on witnesses, and it was all quite garbled and confusing. So we went to the scene. We realised that, unfortunately, a member of the public had been killed, and we realised, on looking at the CCTV, the extreme nature, the unusual nature of the violence. You know, to see a gang of men with Kalashnikovs, quite disciplined, dressed as guards, wearing bulletproof helmets, absolutely brazen and audacious, bordering on reckless, and with a complete disregard for law and order, or for the threat to human life, or the threat of the guards arriving. I suppose it was a milestone in criminal history. Things were never going to be the same again.
There was no guards there. There was a lot of media there. And the only reason we were there wasn't for the sporting event. It was to see really who was with Daniel Kinahan.
Daniel Kinahan was based abroad at that time. We knew he was the kind of day-to-day leader of the cartel. So he was public enemy number one, really, for the police in Ireland in terms of the supply of drugs into the country. And it was notable that there were journalists outside the Regency Hotel that day, but there were no Gardaí.
They had spoken a lot at the time that there was no intelligence to suggest this was happening. There wasn't who had the intelligence, but I would have always thought it was intelligent to be there. We were there because we wanted to gather what we could, see what we could with our small team, and yet the guards hadn't deployed anybody to it.
Let's be clear on one thing. Nobody knew anything was going to happen. The Kinahans didn't know they were going to be attacked, or they'd never come into the country. They believed there was no threat against them. Nobody believed there was a threat against them. And this was not unusual for them. They were there in the full glare of the media with a view to promoting boxing, and they thought it was perfectly safe.
Certainly their actions after the Regency, you know, they really got on top of it. But where were they on the day? That's a reasonable question, I think.
We were now at a different level. This was an absolute affront to law and order and to safety of the public.
It was almost an attack on our democracy. It was a shocking attack, for sure. And we were surprised at the time that more people weren't injured. But I mean, of course, they did commit murder on that day.
The initial thought process was this was obviously to do with the Kinahans. Have any of them been shot? What exactly has happened here? And it was quite chaotic that first hour or so, but it didn't take long for information to come through that a man had been shot dead in the lobby of the hotel, and we then heard the name David Byrne for the first time. Members of the Byrne family were involved in the Kinahan cartel, Liam Byrne and David Byrne being chief among them. They would have been high up in the Kinahan cartel in the day-to-day running of the operations on the ground. They ran the drugs operation in Dublin and I suppose shipping drugs and distributing drugs across Ireland. The Kinahans very much were based in Spain, subsequently in Dubai, but Liam and David Byrne were very serious senior lieutenants within the Kinahan cartel, and I suppose the gunman that ultimately shot David Byrne knew that he was killing somebody who was significant to the cartel. David Byrne was incredibly unlucky. He really should be alive today. The only reason David Byrne is dead is because he ran back into the Regency. He ran back into the lobby of the hotel. Family members have told me since that he ran back in looking for his brother, and that is what cost him his life. If you look at the CCTV footage of what happened in the Regency, the gunman considers for a moment another target, an innocent member of the public, but doesn't shoot them, sees David Byrne without question, kills him. They know who he is, they know he's a senior member of the cartel.
We know it was organised with some military precision, and we know that it went catastrophically wrong because the point of it was to take out Daniel Kinahan, but he got away.
I'm told that the man in drag and another man who didn't hide himself at all, wearing a flat cap, Kevin Murray, who went into the hotel, they actually were within inches of Daniel Kinahan, and they had the opportunity to kill him when a bodyguard, I suppose, or someone who was close to Kinahan threw a water bottle in their direction, and Kinahan was able to escape. I think he went out a back window, so we were told. So Kinahan, you know, he's lucky to have escaped with his life.
It was well planned and it worked from that kind of military point of view. You know, there was gunmen in the room, they were there to make the crowds flee, to come to the door, and then the fake ERU officers were going to go in, and their expectation was they would come face to face with Daniel Kinahan and take off the head of the snake of the Kinahan cartel. That didn't happen.
All the ingredients were there to tell us very, very quickly that this was, I suppose, the outbreak of a full-scale gangland war.
But straight away already, you know, some of the names that we're going to talk about were coming up, which is the Hutches. Gardaí immediately focused and zeroed in on the Hutches. They believed that they were responsible for this. While Gardaí were gathering all of this intelligence and trying to work out who was responsible for the Regency, the Kinahans were already going about identifying those people and figuring out how they were going to kill them.
Two things happened. Two strands of revenge came after the murder of David Byrne. The first was that Daniel Kinahan really had to re-establish himself as the powerful force he was. And at the same time, you had David Byrne, who was a very significant individual himself, whose brother-in-law was a guy called Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, and whose brother was a guy called Liam Byrne. And together that day, really, each having a reason, they sort of formed this blood bond. And together they set a joint offensive against their enemies. Bomber Kavanagh probably for familial reasons, and Daniel Kinahan for his reputation and his standing in the global criminal underworld at that time.
You have to remember that this was, in one sense, it was deeply personal. People who were very closely connected to David Byrne took his murder very personally, and they were out for blood, and they called for that. People who I can't name here, but people who would have been very close to David Byrne said, kill all of them Hutches. And they meant all of them, a total wipeout. Anyone who carried the Hutch name suddenly became a target overnight.
Once David Byrne was killed that time, I think that was the spark that ignited the feud. I don't think there was any stopping it at that stage. It really was a matter of end it, kill them all.
We realised there was going to be a backlash. It came fast and furious within a couple of days, and it just went on a spiral of violence.
The guards will say that the intention of the Hutch gang that day was to try and kill several people and to take out a whole senior tier of the cartel, including Daniel Kinahan. So you have obviously David Byrne dead, you have an effort made to kill Daniel Kinahan, and the revenge is going to come. But I don't think anybody expected it to be as fast as it was.
Only 3 days after the Regency Hotel happened, Eddie Hutch, a brother of Jerry the Monk Hutch, was shot dead at his home in Poplar Row. He was getting out of his car, he went into his house, and as he was going in, he was followed by a gunman who shot him dead in his own home.
The swiftness, I think, of that first retaliation was frightening. And then they just seemed to keep coming. There was a few months, I think, up until certainly the summer, that there seemed to be hit after hit after hit.
This feud was very personal. These people went to school together, they grew up together, you know, they were involved in crime together. This started out as a single entity. You know, it wasn't two, you know, groups feuding. This was a single entity imploding. This is what happened. But these knew each other intimately. Their families knew each other intimately. So when this became a killing ground for them, it left lasting scars. And it was so personal. My view on it and the view of my senior officer at the time was like, you know, this is going to get worse before it gets better.
In the days after the Regency attack, Eddie Hutch was shot dead. At his funeral, mourners arrived to pay their respects, only to find themselves in the Kinahans' crosshairs.
At the Eddie Hutch funeral, which was quite an ordinary affair really, but you had the likes of Gareth Hutch, who would be his nephew carrying his coffin, another relative called Derek Coakley Hutch carrying his coffin, and in the crowd standing beside Jerry Hutch was a man called Noel Duckegg Kerwin, his friend, who had accompanied him to the funeral. All three of those people would be killed in the months after the event. They weren't significant criminals. Some of the people that were killed were suspected of having something to do with the Regency, of having a role in it, but others either carried the Hutch name or were easy targets.
So certainly by that point, the Kinahans were already blaming Jerry the Monk Hutch, rightly or wrongly, for what had happened at the Regency, and they were targeting anybody associated with him, including his friends and his family.
And then really in the following 10 months, we had 9 other people shot dead. So 2016 is really the key year in the feud. Half of the victims that are shot in the space of about a 3-year period are shot during that 1 year. And the attacks just continued. And it definitely did look for a long time like it was getting out of control. It was really out of the control of the guards. They were finding it very hard to keep a lid on all the violence. And just the sheer frequency of these attacks was quite frightening.
Gareth Hutch was a nephew of Jerry the Monk Hutch. Relatively petty criminal, wasn't really on the Garda radar. But again, like many of these Hutch family members, he became a target, an easy target for the Kinahan cartel. Gareth Hutch was embroiled in his own disputes. He had fallen foul of a criminal by the name of Jonathan Keogh. Jonathan Keogh, closely tied to the Kinahan cartel and a very serious criminal, between him and others, orchestrated the murder, which was sanctioned by the Kinahan cartel. And they shot him dead when he was going back to his car at a car park in Avondale House. That's an example early on of one of those murders that, whilst it was directly tied to the feud, other internal disputes got dragged in with it. So there were people who had mutual interests, where the Kinahans were saying, well, you know, yeah, you want this person dead, we want this person dead, and it was of a mutual benefit for them to target someone like Gareth Hutch. But there were many other attempts on other Hutch family members. They were trying to kill Patsy Hutch, at that time the father of Gary Hutch. They were trying to kill Patrick Hutch Jr., who they blamed for the Regency and who they identified as the gunman in drag. They were gung-ho from the 5th of February on to target anybody that they could, be it someone tangentially linked or someone that they believed was directly linked to the Regency.
The Kinahans were paying all sorts of people retainers as spotters. There was also rumours that these professional hit teams were being flown in from outside the country, you know, ninja style nearly. But in actual fact, it was people on the ground who were willing to take that blood money to take out a neighbour nearly. If you look at the murder of Gareth Hutch, which happened in broad daylight in the morning, if I remember, when his murder ultimately came before the courts and those who were charged, like, they would have been childhood friends of the Hutch. They would have gone to the same schools, they would have been neighbours. I mean, Regina Keogh lived in the same block and her brother used her apartment so as he could keep an eye on Gareth Hutch. She was one of them that was jailed for murder. It was all money driven, of course, but there was a sense of whoever was willing to take up a gun and take a chance and a punt, those directing them didn't really care if they were caught or not. It was disorganised and yet organised. It was both those things. And there was some hapless hitmen who went out just trying to earn a wage, and in many cases they took out innocent people who had nothing to do with the feud. Martin O'Rourke and Trevor O'Neill were two people who had absolutely nothing to do with this, and they were killed because one of them was in an area where a target was drinking in a pub, and in Trevor O'Neill's case, one of the most horrific murders of it all, he was on holidays with his family and he happened to have spoken to Jonathan Hutch at the pool, and he was targeted by the same hitman.
2016 was a bloodbath. Parts of the city were at war here. This was unprecedented. You know, I had a father and son killed in this that, you know, had nothing to do with this particular feud. One man on holidays with his family, Trevor O'Neill, murdered in broad daylight because somebody made a mistake. That's unconscionable, unacceptable in our society. You know, you had Martin O'Rourke killed in Sheriff Street mistaken identity. One of the things that sticks in my mind is a female Garda giving him the kiss of life on the ground, and people standing around watching. It's emblazoned on my mind. This is what was happening. She was down trying to keep him alive on the ground on her two knees. It was unbelievable, what was happening.
People talk about this as the Kinahan-Hutch feud, and obviously that's what it is. But perhaps a more accurate description of it would be it's an implosion of a cartel.
There's sometimes, I suppose, a misunderstanding that these are somehow two different factions. This was one gang. The Kinahan cartel had many different branches, which included the Hutches. And Gary Hutch had established himself as a very serious lieutenant within the Kinahan cartel and a right-hand man, really, of Daniel Kinahan.
Gary Hutch and Daniel Kinahan had been really close friends. Like, their friends joked about them having a bromance. They lived together. They would often sit in and watch movies together. They went out, they socialised, they shared everything. They were really, really tight. And you could see from the Operation Shovel files in 2010 that Gary Hutch held a serious management role within the organisation. But things broke down, I think, from about 2014.
Gary Hutch uses the proceeds of an armed robbery back in Ireland to invest in the cartel. And he believes that if he puts in lots of his own cash, this will buy him a senior place in the cartel. But after a few years pass, he becomes frustrated. He thinks that other people are being promoted in the cartel above him.
Gary believed that he could take out Daniel Kinahan and that he could then establish himself as a leader of his own gang. The fact that he thought he could do that and get away with it tells you a lot about him and his character, that he could take out Daniel Kinahan and still survive.
Gary Hutch had been responsible for an attempted or would-be hit on Daniel Kinahan in Spain. An innocent boxer called Jamie Moore was shot that time on the grounds of Daniel Kinahan's mansion in Estepona. There was obviously a police investigation, but the Kinahan cartel launched their own investigation, internal, and they come to the conclusion that Gary Hutch has arranged this would-be murder attempt on Daniel Kinahan, and that he's used a close associate of his as the gunman, who has not done a very good job because he's shot the wrong guy. Back in Dublin some months later, Jerry the Monk Hutch would later tell me that he facilitated a meeting between Daniel and Gary and let them come to an arrangement, which was believed to be that 200,000 was paid in compensation for this hit.
When the Kinahans were looking for retribution for the attempt on Daniel, the €200,000 was paid over. And again, this sounds like something out of a movie, but this is very Gangland. They said that Patrick Hutch needed to be shot in the leg as a punishment shooting.
We know that Patrick Hutch, who's a brother of Gary Hutch, attends the Mater Hospital with gunshot wounds in his knees. We heard evidence from the state witness Jonathan Dowdall that Patrick Hutch was presented to Daniel Kinahan, who personally shot him, kneecapped him basically, because he believed him to have been the gunman that night.
I think the extraordinary thing is that even after that, Gary Hutch still went back to Spain and tried to establish himself. That's what cost him his life.
Gary Hutch somehow believed he was safe to go back to Spain and to set up on his own. He was going to just form his own business, his own cartel. I don't know how he was convinced that, because he was clever and wily up to that point.
Daniel Kinahan couldn't continue to look over his shoulder and obviously decided to hire a hitman. He hired one of his closest friends, James Quinn, to carry out that murder. James Quinn has subsequently been found guilty in relation to that murder, and there was evidence heard in court that that was ordered by Daniel Kinahan personally.
And I do think that Jerry Hutch could understand that, because he understands the way of Gangland. And if someone tries to kill you, you probably never trust them again. And that's just the mechanisms of that world. But then they went for him in Lanzarote in the new year, just months after Gary Hutch was killed. And I think the Hutch organised crime group as a whole realised that it wasn't finished.
There's no going back really then. You're talking about a veteran criminal figure targeted at a bar in Lanzarote. The Hutch organised crime group wasn't going to stand for that. And I think they realised, Gardaí would say, that it was kill or be killed at that point, because They saw that they hadn't just killed Gary, they were now trying to kill Jerry and possibly others. And so that's when they formulated the plan to carry out the Regency.
You have disputes among criminals constantly. Gangland, tit for tat shootings. You have to understand, Ireland has a very violent criminal underworld, and it's very easy to fall out with former business partners and business associates, and a lot of it leads to extreme violence. We're sort of a little bit unique like that in Ireland for a small country. We punch way above our weight in violence in the criminal fraternity.
The Jerry Hutch murder got all our heads up to say, listen, we need to focus on this. This is not the end of something. It's probably just the start. They won't accept this.
Patrick Hutch is a son of Patsy Hutch and is a brother of the late Gary Hutch, who was murdered at the start of this feud. Gardaí began to suspect almost immediately that he was involved in the Regency Hotel attack because he looked quite similar to the gunman that was in drag, who was heavily photographed during the course of the incident. And certainly the Kinahans also suspected that Patrick Hutch was the gunman. They ultimately charged Patrick with the murder of David Byrne and alleged in court that he was this gunman.
When those images emerged of the armed men outside the hotel, the three men that were armed with the AK-47s all had balaclavas on as part of this, mock Gardaí uniform. The other two men did not have balaclavas on. One of them was wearing a flat cap, and the other man was dressed as a woman. He had a blonde wig on, heavy makeup and so on, but you could see the firearms in their hands as they ran away from the hotel. Immediately those images appeared, the talk was that the man dressed as a woman was Patrick Hutch.
When the case opened, I think we were all surprised to realise how heavily reliant the state were on that one piece of evidence. I mean, it seemed to be what the case hinged on.
While the images were clear, they were taken from afar. This person had a wig on. Could it be somebody who looked like Patrick Hutch? Everybody assumed these two people in particular would be very easily caught. One of them was terminally ill, and he died about a year and a half after the attack, so it was impossible to bring any charges against him. The other person who we suspected was Patrick Hutch. Those images were shown to about 500 Garda members, and only 2 Gardaí claimed that they felt it was Patrick Hutch. So I think those images really created false hope that this case was going to be very easily solved. That false hope perhaps put pressure on the guards.
That trial went before the Special Criminal Court, but it ultimately collapsed. And it collapsed because of a tragedy, the death of the leading investigator, the detective superintendent, Colin Fox.
I can remember when I got the call. I was actually down the country and I got the call that night, and it was pretty late at night, and I remember saying to my wife, I have to go right now, I have to go right now. That was it. And straight up to the station, and it was just awful up there. People were physically, broken in there. He was a lovely, lovely person, really, really professional at his job. Was he in a challenging situation? Absolutely. The murder at the hotel just really piled the pressure on.
Colin Fox is a highly respected member of An Garda Síochána, and we know from his inquest that he was under a lot of pressure in those days where he was investigating the Regency Hotel incident, a very serious crime. And upon the death of Colin Fox, who really would have been leading the trial through evidence, the DPP ultimately made the decision to enter a null prosequi, meaning that the charge was thrown out effectively and Patrick Hutch walked. I remember being in court that day, and the family of David Byrne were enraged by this and were quite audible in their outrage in court. Patrick Hutch was facilitated in leaving the court by going out a back entrance. Because that charge was thrown out, Patrick will likely never face prosecution in relation to it again.
Certainly the Gardaí were under pressure to solve the Regency Hotel attack. It was seen as so brazen and so daring that you just could not let 5 armed men, 3 of them dressed as guards, walk into a crowded hotel and open fire and kill a person and not catch those people.
We knew for some time that Gardaí were targeting Jerry Hutch and they wanted to charge him with the murder of David Byrne. Out of the blue one day, the Spanish authorities carried out this arrest in Fungarola, arresting Jerry Hutch in a pizza restaurant that he frequented. It would be some time before he was extradited. He obviously challenged that extradition. He has said since that he fully expected to be extradited and to be arrested, and that he was waiting for it.
Even though the Patrick Hutch trial collapsed in 2019, certainly the investigation into the Regency attack continued, and one of the people who was under investigation for years was Jerry Hutch. Now, this is a very well-known person. He had been involved in armed robberies 20, 30 years ago. He's one of the best-known people in the history of Irish organised crime, and he has proven very adept at staying one step ahead of the guards and one step ahead of everybody.
Very little happened, in the Hutch family without Jerry giving the nod, particularly something that was going to be planned to this level, and something that was going to roll out in front of the whole world, which it was that evening on the news. The whole world was watching this taking place. Our understanding at the time would have been nothing like that was going to happen within that group that he wasn't part of.
The state, we thought, was going to argue that Jerry Hutch was in some way involved in the organisation of this overall operation, which was quite a sophisticated operation. There's up to 12 people at least involved in the Regency. We didn't know until the day that the case was actually opened, that the accusation against the monk was actually going to be that he was the gunman. I still remember hearing that on the day of the trial with my mouth open. None of us knew that this was going to be the case that they were going to actually bring against him up until the trial started. And that's because it wasn't until Jonathan Dowdall got involved.
Jonathan Dowdall was seen as a successful businessman. He had his own electrics company. He was briefly a member of Sinn Féin. He was in jail at the time that he was charged with the Regency.
He was convicted in relation to the waterboarding and torture of a man and served a significant sentence in relation to that. He and his father told this man they were members of the IRA, and they put fear and terror into him and waterboarded him.
This guy had tried to buy a motorbike off him. It was a very bizarre story, but Dowdall believed that he was trying to trick him and had sort of basically kidnapped him, locked him in a garage, and along with his father, tortured him. The reason he was in jail for that was because when the guards raided his home as part of the Regency investigation, they found a USB stick and he had videoed this attack and it was all on it. So he had a tricky past, to say the least.
I think the big weakness with this case was that Jonathan Dowdall, who aided the Hutch gang's attack on the Regency Hotel, he decided that he would turn state's witness and he would give evidence against Jerry Hutch. I suppose when we first learned this was going to happen, we maybe thought that this was a very strong witness for the state and this would be very damaging to Jerry Hutch. But really, Jonathan Dowdall was such a bad witness that he was great for Jerry Hutch. The allegation will be that he was centrally involved in the planning of it, and also that he was one of the 3 men dressed in the mock Garda uniforms on the day, armed with the AK-47s. That essentially was the state's case.
The prosecution, in their opening, pretty much contended that he was the gunman, not just one of the gunmen, that he was the man who pulled the trigger and who killed and murdered David Byrne.
Jonathan Dowdall was a horrific witness for the state, but once they'd married themselves to him, they couldn't undo it. And he ultimately gave them that piece of information that he supposedly met with Jerry Hutch in Whitehall, in a park, Ellenfield Park, and that this confession happened where Jerry Hutch told him that he was the gunman who shot and killed David Byrne and that he'd felt bad about that.
A state witness has to have evidence that is corroborated. There has to be something to back it up, or else it's useless. And yet, there was nothing to back this up.
Obviously, Gardaí did their best to investigate that, and they looked at phone data. That ultimately completely conflicted with Jonathan Dowdall's narrative because it showed him to be at home at a time and place when he said he was actually meeting Jerry Hutch in this park. I do remember something that Miss Justice Tara Byrne said in the trial, that she would have thought that that would be a key moment in Jonathan Dowdall's life that he would never forget, and yet he repeatedly on the witness stand tripped himself up over exactly the date and time in which this crucial meeting between him and Jerry Hutch, where this confession to murder supposedly happened.
You seem to be waiting all the time for this moment when you'd go, that's the evidence, but it never came during the trial. The evidence felt flimsy against Hutch.
You need only listen to Jonathan Dowdall for one day of that trial, which we listened to him for a full week straight being cross-examined, and you'd know that this guy is a moron, an idiot, and that he was used to some extent. I cannot understand still to this day how so much trust and faith was put in someone like him. He tripped himself up repeatedly in his own lies, and he just could not be a reliable witness. From day one, you knew that. We were waiting to find out what evidence there was to actually suggest that Jerry Hutch was the gunman. But then when you have this man get on the stand and completely be torn to shreds in the first 5 minutes, the trial collapsed from that moment on, really.
With the benefit of hindsight, you can say that Dowdall really single-handedly completely undermined the state's case around Jerry Hutch.
Hutch was up on one charge, which was murder. And in her judgment, Justice Tara Burns pretty much said that she hadn't the evidence in front of her for murder, but had other charges, for example, weapons charges, be taken against him. They might have had something. So mistakes were made, definitely, by the state. They were left embarrassed, and Jerry Hutch walked free to celebrity fanfare.
Heard any reaction? Heard any reaction to your acquittal for murder? Take him on alone. He's innocent. We're not. He's innocent. He don't know. He done nothing wrong.
It was an extraordinary 10 minutes or so, really at the end of a very unusual trial after a really spectacular attack at the Regency Hotel.
Despite two high-profile trials ending in failure for the state, there had been key breakthroughs. The Kinahan cartel was facing growing pressure, both at home and abroad.
Gardaí would say the reaction to the Regency ultimately led to the downfall of the Kinahan cartel. Daniel Kinahan could not let this go. He took it extremely personally, the attempt on his own life and the death of his friend. He brought the heat upon himself from that day on, because they carried out a really horrific murder on Eddie Hutch and then 15 more murders over the course of the feud. That was an attack on the state. The Regency was an attack on the state, and that was carried out by the Hutch crime group, but the response by the Kinahans showed a flagrant disregard for the law, that they felt that they could go after anybody, innocent or otherwise, and shoot them dead. And so the heat was on them straight away from that day forward. Gardaí were not going to let this go.
2016, we were counting the checkpoints in the thousands. It was just a totally different place to come into. People didn't want to come into the North Inner City. People didn't want to come in to town because this was happening. Everybody knew it. It's quite different now.
There are certainly more armed units in the city. It would be difficult for an event like the Regency to happen without an armed response getting to the scene quicker. But you never know what criminals are doing, and you never know what's around the corner.
Gardaí have learned how to police Gangland in a way that they never have before, and that has no doubt saved an awful lot of lives. We're talking after a year where there were no Gangland murders for the first time in many decades. So, that shows you that they're really on top of it.
There's a big difference in how the Gardaí approach the policing of organised crime now. I think the moment of the Regency woke everyone up to the fact that this is actually narco-terrorism. We have seen a huge amount of criminals who were in the surrounds of the Kinahan organised crime group go to jail. They have faced charges in relation to money laundering, directing criminal organisations. There was one finger on the trigger but many hands on the gun, and I think that describes the difference now, that the Gardaí now go after all the hands on the gun as opposed to just the finger on the trigger.
I mean, when we look back over the last 10 years, over 80 people have been jailed for crimes that are linked to the Kinahan Hutch feud. About 80 of those people are on the Kinahan side and about 10 on the Hutch side. So the progress that the Guards made really completely wiped out the Kinahan organisation here in Ireland. It may have taken a while for the Guards to get on top of it. A lot of people lost their lives, but the Kinahan cartel's Irish operation was completely wiped out by the Guards.
Daniel Kinahan left the country and went to Dubai. They couldn't touch him, but he had to leave all of his operations in Spain. The Spanish authorities became much more engaged, and the cooperation between the Spanish and the Irish authorities meant that the Kinahans had to basically say bye-bye to Spain.
I don't think that the Kinahans, if you try and step into their shoes briefly, could have made a different decision than they did, but to retaliate with a show of strength and power that was going to reinforce their position at that point, which was they were at the global table of narco-terrorism, really, and they had been challenged. It was a business decision they made to literally reap havoc on the streets of Dublin. That's the nature of the Kinahans. They left behind people who they threw money at to do their dirty work, and they didn't really care that the Irish state was going to go up against them or dismantle them. They were at that point, Ireland was nothing to them. It was a very small market to sacrifice for their reputation.
Even though the Kinahan organisation has really been under intense investigation in various parts of the world for the last 10 years since the Regency attack, it has to be said that they are still heavily involved in the drugs trade and particularly the supply of cocaine throughout Europe. Daniel Kinahan is regarded as a member of the European super cartel that's headquartered in Dubai, and it's estimated that that controls about 1/3 of the European cocaine market. These remain really serious players, and it is going to be hard to bring them down. These people have grown super rich over the last 25 years, and when these gangs grow and they become cartels and they have a global reach, they've got so much cash that they can just outsource all of the risk. And this is why they are very hard to catch.
The United States Department of State is pleased to announce a reward of up to $5 million for information leading to the financial disruption of the KTCO or the arrest and convictions of its leaders.
I remember where we were when the announcement happened in April of 2022. That Gardaí were working quite closely with the authorities in the US. The Department of Treasury and the DEA, the Drugs Enforcement Agency, were actively involved in investigating the Kinahans. In that announcement, they announced unprecedented sanctions against the leaders of the Kinahan cartel, so Christy Kinahan Sr., Daniel Kinahan and Christy Jr. I remember us saying, you know, this is a major step, because when the US get involved, you know, they get their man.
My view is, once you get your face on one of those, there's only one way it's all going to end. I don't think anybody from the Mexican cartel overbosses to anybody else has really escaped those, so it wouldn't like it to be me.
There was an acceptance that, look, you know, nobody in a state agency like and Garda Síochána can do this on your own, because you're dealing with people that are operating internationally with international networks and international supporters in terms of firearms, drugs, cash, etc. So, you know, if they're going to work on that level internationally, we have to have the same structures and systems in place from a policing perspective. And while there was lots of that going on for years, not to the depth that it was developed very quickly once we were subjected to what was happening in Ireland and particularly in Dublin.
Obviously, almost 4 years on from that, they're still in Dubai. They're certainly still headquartered there. They're still free. They haven't been charged with any crimes, but they remain under investigation. And senior Gardaí, when you speak to them privately, they say they're very confident they will bring charges against some of the Kinahans. They're probably most hopeful in relation to Daniel Kinahan.
In the last year, we saw Sean McGovern returned to Ireland. He's in jail facing a murder charge here. He has been Daniel Kinahan's number 2, and that is absolutely significant, to say the least. There's only one more step to Daniel Kinahan.
I don't think any criminal anywhere is so successful at evading the law. They have to be lucky all the time. Law enforcement have to be lucky once. All criminals who are being sought by law enforcement are always wondering about the knock on the door.
As we're talking now about the Regency 10 years on, none of the people who were directly involved in that hit have been caught for it, and that's extraordinary. Gardaí have to be commended for the way that they responded to the feud and to the amount of people that have been caught for the other murders that were committed as part of this feud. But that audacious hit, which was quite terribly executed but very well planned, the people who orchestrated that are still walking around free.
I personally do not believe the state of the stomach to go for another Regency trial. I could be wrong, but there's two that have ended in disaster for the state. The Patrick Hutch trial, which ended in a null prosequi, and the Jerry Hutch trial, which was a huge embarrassment for the state to see a man like Jerry Hutch walk free. I'm sure the Regency investigation, if you ask the Gardaí, they'll say to you it's ongoing and they're still following leads. I just, I'll eat my hat if we have another one.
We haven't boxed this off here. We haven't brought this to a conclusion. One of the most audacious crimes in Irish history, hasn't been solved yet, But I wouldn't be putting that one in the box and putting the lid on it quite yet.
Realistically, that case, although it's 10 years old, is still open. People could still be charged in the future.
There's still people walking around out there who had a part to play in these.
We don't know, still to this day, where Jerry Hutch actually was on the 5th of February 2016. All we know is that the state ultimately didn't prove that he was in the Regency and that he was the gunman. Nonetheless, the Kinahans believed, and Gardaí believed, that he was in some way involved in that. The evidence that came out in the Special Criminal Court, it appeared as though the evidence suggested that Jerry Hutch might have gotten involved in the aftermath of the Regency, in the clean-up effectively, but that the actual shooting itself was planned and orchestrated by Patsy Hutch.
It was a name that was just constantly coming up, Patsy Hutch, out of this trial. In actual fact, sitting there listening to the evidence, you would think, why is Patsy Hutch not here in the dock?
You have a judge in the highest court of the land saying that this man who was not on trial, that there was actually evidence that he was the person who orchestrated the whole thing. But there was extraordinary evidence about the actions of Patsy Hutch. All of that evidence is out there, but he's never faced trial in relation to any of that. He's never commented in relation to any of that. But he was pinned as being the man responsible for organising it, and the evidence suggests that Jerry Hutch was in some way responsible for the clean-up afterwards.